So today, though, I'm going to be talking about some material that comes out of my book, The Death of Humanity. Actually, I gave this talk, I don't remember how many years ago, maybe a dozen years ago, at a Christian leadership conference in Washington, D.C., which is run by what's called CRU today, Campus Crusade for Christ, I think they were still called at that time. And so this sort of the talk that I gave actually was before I wrote the book and sort of fed into my interest in working on the book, The Death of Humanity. But let me preface it by giving you this quotation from a Holocaust survivor named Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl said, quote, "If we present a man with a concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him. When we present man as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of instinct, heredity, and environment, we feed the nihilism to which modern man is, in any case, prone. I became acquainted," Frankl continued, "with the last stage of that corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz, which are not that far from here, the gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, as the Nazis liked to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely convinced," he continued, "that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers." And so that was Viktor Frankl's spin, which I think has a lot of truth to it, and that's what I'm going to sort of unpack today for us. I'm going to focus primarily on three major thinkers of the 19th century who are going to have a profound impact on some of these things. In fact, you could argue that all three of them had impact on Nazism in certain kinds of ways. The Darwinism with the social Darwinism, Marx with socialism, National Socialism, although he was anti-Marxist in ways. But certain Nietzsche also fed into his ideas too in certain ways. But in any case, I'm not going to get into that in great detail. I've done that in other points. This point that Frankl makes, though, is also a point that has been made by quite a number of Christian apologists. And if you read C.S. Lewis, for example, he's got a very short book called The Abolition of Man, where he's looking at a pretty narrow slice of at this question, but still he's dealing with this question of how we're abolishing the view of humans as having dignity and such by considering them simply the product of some combination of heredity or environment. And also he followed that up in his trilogy, his space trilogy, with That Hideous Strength. And I discussed both of those C.S. Lewis books in the last chapter of The Death of Humanity as well. Also, if you look at Francis Schaeffer's works, and Schaeffer had a profound impact on me when I was an undergraduate back in the late 1970s. Schaeffer's works speak to this issue as well, especially his book Back to Freedom and Dignity, where he takes on B.F. Skinner, a prominent behaviorist psychology. B.F. Skinner wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And so Schaeffer was responding to that with Back to Freedom and Dignity, because B.F. Skinner had argued that humans are just the product of their environment. It's just reflexes of things. So there's been a lot of various critics. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is another prominent critic of certainly the Marxist vision of reality that I'm going to be talking about here today as well, critiquing the vision of humans just being the product of their environment. And so if you read like One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, for example, there's a passage in there where Ivan Denisovich Zhukov makes this comment about how they can't change my nature. And of course that was what their whole purpose was supposed to be at that at the concentration camp that he was in. They're trying to change his nature, and they thought that if you just change the economic system, you can change human nature. We'll get to that in just a little bit when we get to Marx a little bit. Okay, now these secular thinkers, and not just the three that I'm going to be talking about today, but a whole range of secular thought over the past couple of centuries, have introduced their ideas very often in the context of trying to promote what they often refer to as humanism. In fact, Karl Marx called his views humanism. A lot of existentialists, Jean-Paul Sartre called his, he wrote a famous essay called Existentialism is a Humanism. We've got today the Humanist Manifesto from the 20th, two versions of it, the Humanist Manifesto 1, Humanist Manifesto 2 in the 20th century. So there's a lot of secular thinkers over the past couple of centuries who have called their philosophies humanism. And the reason they do that is because they have rejected God, and so they want to shift the focus from God to humanity. And so they're trying to exalt humans, and claim that this is why they're they're calling their philosophies humanism. But very interestingly, I think they run aground on the saying of Jesus, where he said, "He who exalts himself will be abased." And so in exalting humanity, they actually end up debasing humanity by getting rid of God and thinking that somehow this is going to make humans better. Now, to give a more contemporary example than the three I'm going to present today, Michel Foucault, who's one of the most famous philosophers of the late 20th century, French philosopher, actually argued quite forthrightly. He was sort of a disciple of Nietzsche, not just Nietzsche, actually he was a disciple of Marquis de Sade also, where we get the word sadism from. But Foucault was profoundly influential, though, certainly in Europe and in the United States, in the academy. He argued quite forthrightly that the death of God that Nietzsche had introduced, and which he agreed with, also resulted ultimately in the death of humanity. And he actually uses that term, the death of man. I mean, he's writing in French, so I think the actual translation was the death of man in his writings. And so even though they're talking about humanism, they're ending up demoting humanity. Now it's interesting that many of them actually will admit, many secular thinkers will admit that their philosophies end up demoting humans one way or another. So we've got people like Peter Singer, who is a prominent bioethics professor at Princeton University in the United States. He's from Australia originally. And you got a couple of his works here, Unsanctifying Human Life. So again, we see the demotion of humans, and Singer tries to bring them down to the level of animals. He's a big animal rights activist as well, seeing humans and animals as being equivalent in many kinds of ways. Rethinking Life and Death, the collapse of our traditional ethics. And the traditional ethics he's talking about there are JudeoChristian ethics of the value and dignity of human life. Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist biologist, evolutionary biologist, has also said quite clearly that Darwinism erodes the notion that humans have some kind of claim of being special. And in the 19th century, the most prominent German Darwinist, Ernst Haeckel, blasted Christianity for what he called its anthropocentric view. And sometimes you'll see that word around today, too, in Darwinian discourse, people complaining that Christianity is too anthropocentric, focused on humans. And so here in the 1911 edition of Ernst Haeckel's book, Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte, he has a picture here of some imaginary, just a painting of what the missing link might have looked like between some kind of anthropoid creature and humans. And so the idea is that humans are just really nothing more than an animal there. Several years ago, a little bit more than a decade ago, a University of Texas biologist, evolutionary biologist, became rather notorious for a very short period of time for his expressions of opposition to what he called anthropocentrism. He used that same term, in fact. And he expressed the wish that in a talk that he gave at the Texas Academy of Sciences, he was being honored as the outstanding scientist of the year in Texas. He said that he thought it would be a great thing if 90% of the population of the world would be eliminated. He wasn't saying that he thought we should go do that as humans to each other, but he said it might be a good thing if there were an airborne Ebola virus. That's the way he framed it. It might be a nice thing if there's an Ebola virus that would escape somehow and become airborne and take out 90% of the human population, because he thinks we've way overpopulated the globe. So these are just some examples of how these secular viewpoints have devalued human life in a number of different ways. Now, over the past few centuries, there are two kind of philosophical movements that it seems to me have given impetus toward this devaluing of human life. And Darwin is going to be one of my examples, Marx the other, and then later I'm going to get to Nietzsche as a separate movement. But there's two main movements that, starting off in the Enlightenment period in the 18th century, we're going to have a pretty profound impact on this devaluing of human life that we see with us today. First of all, materialism or atheism. The belief that the only thing that exists is matter and energy. And this became influential first in some intellectual circles in the 18th century, in the French Enlightenment in particular. And essentially this was going to reduce humans to just matter in motion. You know, humans, and so Julien de la Mettrie, one of the more prominent materialists in the middle part of the century in 1747, wrote a book called Man the Machine. Man the Machine. And so he basically claims that humans are just a machine. And so we can understand everything scientifically. Everything is determined by the preceding natural causation. And that if we could just somehow understand all of the parameters, you know, to start with, then we'd be able to predict everything that would happen to humans. There's no, obviously, he's eliminating any idea that humans have any kind of soul, or that humans have any kind of free will. And so essentially everything is determined. And so we get this idea of determinism. Another movement that was going to rise especially by the early 19th century, that was going to be very important in the devaluing human life, was positivism. Positivism was a movement in the early 19th century that believed that the only kind of knowledge we have is science. That scientific knowledge is the only way to get knowledge, which, by the way, is a self-refuting statement. Because if science is the only way to get knowledge, then where did you learn that? You didn't learn that from a scientific experiment. Science didn't tell you that science is the only path to knowledge. So it's a self-refuting statement. But positivists didn't realize that, or wouldn't agree with that in any case, and believe that science was the only path to knowledge. So anything that's outside of science, then they would claim is unknowable. So positivists were not atheists, they were agnostics. And the term agnostic didn't even exist early in the 19th century. The term agnostic only came about later in the 19th century. But positivism and agnosticism are pretty similar. And I should say this about agnosticism. When the word agnosticism was first coined in the 19th century, it didn't just mean, like it does sometimes today, a person who just doesn't know if there's a God or not. You know, so some people today would call themselves agnostic, and they would say, well, I don't know if there's a God or not. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Maybe you know, but I don't know. Agnosticism as a term was originally coined, and this is certainly what the positivists believe, was the idea that I don't know if God exists, you don't know if God exists, and it's in principle impossible to know if God exists. That's sort of the strong notion of agnosticism. That's how it was actually framed initially by those who embraced the idea of agnosticism. So, and that's, again, also known as positivism. Now, both of these movements, materialism and positivism, both reduced humans to the results of, you know, the preceding causation. So humans essentially become puppets. They're just controlled by other kinds of forces outside of themselves. And those forces can be either their heredity or their biology, or it could be their environment, or it can be some combination of those two. I mean, most people believe in some combination of those two. But interestingly, over the course of history, from the time of the Enlightenment to the present, many thinkers have sort of put their emphasis on one or the other. Either biological determinism, we're determined by our heredity, our biological makeup, or environmental determinism, the idea that we're just determined by our environment, our education, our upbringing, and the things all around us. So one thing that this is going to do then, if we believe in a deterministic, that humans are just determined by these other things, then this strips humanity of any kind of moral agency, any kind of moral responsibility. And in fact, Richard Dawkins, in one place, talks about this spoof where Basil Fawlty, this comedian, has this car that won't start. And so what does he do? He hits the car with a branch and bashes the car. It won't start. He gets mad at it, and bashes it. That's going to do some good, right? And Dawkins uses this as an illustration of how people who get mad at people for misbehaving or for not doing things right, of what they do, and how our criminal justice system treats people who act badly. And what he says is that we're just like Basil Fawlty. We're just sort of bashing on these people for doing something wrong. But the problem is, he says, that humans are just like that machine. And he said humans who act badly are like a defective machine. He actually uses that term, defective machine. Now, I don't know where by the way, he gets this notion of defective anyway, because in a deterministic closed universe, there is no moral responsibility. So, quote, bad behavior, there's nothing bad about it. It's just behavior. It's all the same. There's nothing good or bad about any of it. But in any case, he argues that we shouldn't punish people for doing things for their behavior. We're just trying to find a way to fix it. We just got to fix the defect, find what's wrong with it, and fix it, somehow. And that's sort of the idea of, again, the notion that there's no moral responsibility for people who are, if you're just determined by either your heredity or your environment. Okay, so now I want to start, let me talk just a little bit now about biological determinism, and then I'll turn to environmental determinism, and then I'm going to hit on some anti-determinist views of Nietzsche. And the biological determinism, I'm going to look mainly at Darwinism, and so there's the Darwin side. The environmental determinism, I'm going to look mainly at Marx, although there's others too, and then I'll look at Nietzsche toward the end here. So now, biological determinism. Now, there were already in the Enlightenment period some biological determinists among some of these materialists, but in the wake of Darwin's theory becoming influential in the late 19th century, biological determinism was becoming a very powerful movement in European thought. And certainly by the 1890s, biological determinism was going to be extremely important. Interestingly, one of the people who was going to be pushing biological determinism very strongly at that period was Darwin's cousin named Francis Galton. Francis Galton is considered the founding father of the eugenics movement, the movement to try to improve human heredity, to try to basically engineer better humans by controlling reproduction one way or the other. And people in the eugenics movement sometimes had different ways of trying to control reproduction, but the idea was some way we need to control reproduction. And one of the premises that comes out in this whole movement that Galton was going to found, promoting this, was that some people are superior and inferior too, but I'll get to that in just a second. Darwin himself, by the way, Galton published his views in the 1860s, and then in 1869 published one of his more important early works called Hereditary Genius, in which he argued that genius was a hereditary thing. And when he's talking about genius, he's not just talking about intellectual capacities, he also was talking about moral capacities and moral character. And so Galton and many of these biological determinists saw morality as being biologically determined. So if a person is loyal or thrifty or all these different moral or truthful, or on the other side deceitful, he thought these are biological characteristics. This is ingrained in your heredity. I mean, they didn't know about genes at that time. We'd say today it's in your genes. In fact, the title of my chapter in The Death of Humanity is "My Genes Made Me Do It." Okay, because the idea is that your genes or your heredity is causing you to do this kind of behavior. Now, Darwin actually did adopt a good deal of Galton's ideas about biological determinism. Galton was actually publishing his things before Darwin published his work on human evolution. Darwin published his Origin of Species in 1859. Galton, in fact, interestingly said that he came upon his ideas about eugenics while he was reading Darwin's Origin of Species. So there's a real clear connection right there, too, between Darwinism and the eugenics movement. And then Darwin in the 1860s was reading his cousin's articles that he was publishing, and then finally his book that he put out. And Darwin didn't publish his Descent of Man until 1871. And so in Descent of Man, Darwin argued that character traits are biologically innate. So things like loyalty, thrift, diligence, deceit, laziness, all these other kinds. These are all just biological traits of humans. And so Galton was going to be profoundly influential in building this idea. I mean, Darwin expressed it too, but Galton was going to be more important in trying to sort of build a movement out of this. And by the 1890s, and especially in the early 1900s, this was going to be a very powerful movement across Europe and also in the United States. Now, this is actually from the U.S., this was a display that the American Eugenics Society put on in county fairs and state fairs in the United States. And the basic upshot of the idea here is that some people are superior and some people are inferior. And the wrong people are reproducing. The idea here is that some people are born to be a burden on the rest. So there's people that are hereditarily defective, as they would call them, or people of negative value. That was a word used sometimes too to discuss these different people. And here it has these lights flashing every so often, telling you how often one of these people is being born that have these different kinds of hereditary traits. And so here on this side it says America needs less of these. This one light's flashing every 48 seconds. This light's flashing every 50 seconds. Every 50 seconds, a person is committed to jail in the United States. Very few normal persons ever go to jail. The idea is that people that are going to jail are biologically inferior. It's in their heredity. There was a book by an Italian criminologist, Cesare Lombroso. But Cesare Lombroso was an Italian criminologist. He's considered a founder of criminology. And he'd put forth this idea of the born criminal. That was the title of one of his books back in the 1870s, I think. And it was long before this, anyway, too. So the idea that criminals are biologically inherited came from Lombroso and others. And there were a lot of other German thinkers, too. A guy named Hans Kurella was promoting similar kinds of ideas in Germany, and he was considered a disciple of Lombroso. So America needs more of these, and so this light flashes every 7.5 minutes. So these lights are flashing faster than these lights, and these are sort of the so-called bad people reproducing, and these are the good people reproducing at a much slower rate. So the idea here is there is a good deal of fear being generated as to who's reproducing at this time. So the weak and the sickly then are supposedly out-reproducing the healthy and the strong. And so they were trying to find a way to remedy that. And so trying to find kind of ways of controlling reproduction to do that. By the early 20th century, the favorite method settled upon by many people in the eugenics movement was compulsory sterilization. Sterilize those people who are considered genetically inferior at the time. And the United States actually took the lead in that worldwide. In 1907, the state of Indiana passed the first compulsory sterilization law in the world. But Scandinavia was second. Denmark, I think it was 1929 with Denmark. Sweden followed suit as well. Then Germany, of course, became the most radical under the Nazi regime with their eugenics movement and compulsory sterilization. Before I get to that, though, another aspect to biological determinism, in addition to looking at people with disabilities and people who are considered biologically inferior sort of within society, scientific racism was also a very prominent way of expressing biological determinism. The idea here is that certain races have biological characteristics that make them superior to other races. And again, Charles Darwin himself expressed this idea in The Descent of Man, where he argued that humans were locked in a struggle for existence, just like other animals were, and that certain races were superior and inferior, and even talked at times about, in fact, he looked at things like the Tasmanians who were going extinct at the time, the Australian Aborigines and others, and he saw the Europeans as driving them out, and he used this as an example of human evolution. This is how evolution happens, by these superior Europeans, going and, wiping out, exterminating these other races. In fact, there's a whole section about 3 pages in The Descent of Man called On the Extermination of Races. And so this is considered an element of the Darwinian struggle for existence, as they're locked in this struggle for existence. By the 1890s and early 20th century, most anthropologists in Europe and in the United States had embraced scientific racism in one form or another. Here's a slide showing Ernst Haeckel, again the most prominent German Darwinist of the late 19th, early 20th century. This is the frontispiece to his work, The Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte, one of his most famous books before he wrote one in 1900 that became a bestseller called Der Welträtsel. In any case, this book is showing the different races of humanity, and so you have 6 different portrayals of human races, and then here you have 6 different simian species. And if you look at the number 6 human race and the number 7, which is portraying a simian race, notice how close they are in the way that they're depicted. Okay, and that's done for a very specific reason. This one has a little more hair, but otherwise they look about the same. And if you don't just look at the picture and get the idea, there's a caption that goes along with this picture. And the caption says, the difference between the highest human and the lowest human is greater than the distance between the lowest human and the highest ape. So the distance from here to here is lots. You got 6 steps to get there even here. The distance from here to here is just small. So it's just a small gap here between humans and animals. In fact, Haeckel actually was so fanatical in his trying to distinguish the human races that he claimed that there were 10 different human species. He wanted to divide them up into species. Not only that, but he divided those 10 species into 4 separate genera. And so that's how much he was dividing out the races and trying to show how distinct they were. And if you think about it, by the way, that actually did serve a strategy in trying to convince people of Darwinian evolution, because you had to show as much variation as possible, and you wanted to show as little variation between species and as much variation within species. That makes Darwinism more that would convince people of Darwinism if you could show that there's really not much gap between species. Species are really close together, and so that's how they had to do it in terms of human evolution. Now, Darwin himself did try to explain all human characteristics as similar to animal traits, and he did try to sort of make humans as close to apes as possible and close to other animal species, and try to explain the different traits that humans had as being as close as possible to other animals and such. And so this was going to sort of demote humanity from their pedestal, so to speak, and Darwin was pretty forthright about that in a lot of different ways. Now, as Frankl suggested, when I quoted at the very beginning of my talk here, this biological determinism, in both its forms, the scientific racism, as well as the eugenics movement, was indeed going to pave the way for Auschwitz, as he suggested. In fact, interestingly, when I first began my research project that became my book From Darwin to Hitler, that came out in 2004, I wasn't even thinking about Hitler or the Nazis. I started that research project looking at the way that Darwinian thinkers, biologists, anthropologists, even some sociologists and other social thinkers, even historians that were trying to apply Darwinism to society. I was looking at the way that they were trying to replace Judeo-Christian ethics and Kantian ethics and other kinds of ethical theories with evolutionary ethics. And so my project was to look at evolutionary ethics. That was really what my research project was all about. But as I began researching evolutionary ethics in the late 19th and early 20th century, what I discovered was that people in the eugenics movement were the people who were writing about evolutionary ethics by the 1890s and 1900s, early 1900s. And I've discovered, I already knew about the scientific racism and the biological racism there, and it started becoming very clear to me that people writing about evolutionary ethics, a lot of their ideas did seem pretty similar to Nazi ideology. I mean, my PhD is in European intellectual history, and especially German intellectual history, and so I'd studied about the Nazis, even though I even though I wasn't thinking my research project was going to focus on them. But it became pretty clear to me that Hitler's ideology had a lot of similarities with these evolutionary ethics ideas, and so in fact I then put that into my book From Darwin to Hitler, and even wrote a separate book later too called Hitler's Ethic, that looks at Hitler's ideology and shows how social Darwinism and evolutionary ethics were integrated into his thinking. So it did indeed pave the way toward Auschwitz, because Hitler's worldview was shaped by biological determinism. Hitler thought that humans were determined by their biology, by their racial heredity, or even within the Germans, he was pushing for eugenics and making differentiations in that kind of way. So Hitler embraced social Darwinism, scientific racism, and eugenics. So here's a shot from a book. This is actually, interestingly, from a 1944 book put out during World War II called the Kriegsweihnachtsbuch. And by the way, in that Kriegsweihnachtsbuch, you won't find a word about Jesus. There's nothing in there about Jesus, even though it's about Christmas. But this is at the opening of the book. This is sort of the frontispiece of the book. And it says there, all of nature is a violent struggle between power and weakness, an eternal victory of the strong over the weak. And so this is the social Darwinist mentality of, we need to destroy the weak, the victory of the strong over them. And this is not exactly peace on earth, goodwill toward men. As you think of as Christmas message that, you should be given to the Germans, or maybe Silent Night or something like that. But quite a different message here. Of course, obviously they're in the middle of, toward the end by this time of World War II. This is going to be coloring his ideas. Here's another shot. This is actually a school poster that was used during the Nazi period, devised in the 1930s. And the top of it has a caption which says, "Elimination of the sick and weak in nature." And so you see these pictures of a raptor who has a hare that he's killed. Apparently the idea is that this must have been one of the weaker hares, or the one that wasn't as fast or whatever, less fit, so that's why it gets killed. So elimination of the weak and sick. And here's a sickly looking tree that this man is going to cut down. And so at the bottom it says here, whatever does not meet the demands of existence is destroyed. Now interestingly, this was actually done in the 1930s, before World War II, and there was an accompanying explanation of what the teacher, the biology teacher, this is a biology class, the biology teacher was supposed to be using this to explain compulsory sterilization program that the Nazis were running. That we need to eliminate those that are weak and sick. And at that time, the way they were doing that, starting in 1933, they'd passed a law in July 1933 for compulsory sterilization. It actually didn't go into effect until January 1934. That's when they actually started sterilizing people who they identified as inferior or weaker, and so people with congenital hereditary illnesses. But I find it interesting here that both of the examples actually involve death. They're not sterilizing anything here. They're killing things here, which is sort of a harbinger of things to come, because in 1939, Hitler signed a directive for the killing of people with disabilities. And so from early 1940, when they actually began the killing operations, until the close of the war, the Nazis were going to kill over 200,000 Germans with disabilities, plus tens of thousands, and there's not even a good number. I've never been able to find a good statistic for this one. Tens of thousands of others in occupied territories in Poland and Czech Republic and other places during World War II. So, in addition, of course, he was going to eliminate 6 million Jews, whom he also thought were inferior, millions of Slavs, Russian POWs, gypsies, 300,000 to 400,000 gypsies approximately, and others, because he thought that by doing that, he would be promoting evolutionary progress by getting rid of these inferior peoples. And interestingly, when you look at the Jews specifically, Hitler believed, because of a belief in biological determinism, he thought that behavior was determined. And he believed all these stereotypes about the Jews, that he thought the Jews were greedy, lascivious, deceitful, and all these other kinds of negative moral traits. And so he thought the Jews were inherently biologically immoral. So he thought it was, you can't just, re-educate them, you can't change them in any kind of way like that. So the only way to deal with the Jewish problem, as they called it, or Jewish question, as they called it, was to eliminate them one way or the other, which could mean expulsion, or ultimately, especially once expulsion was no longer possible, extermination. And Hitler thought that by exterminating the Jews, he was making the world more moral. Because the Jews were immoral. And he thought the Germans were moral. He thought the Germans had all these moral traits. They're diligent, they're hardworking, they're truthful, they're trustworthy, and all these positive traits. And so he thought that actually by eliminating the Jews, he was actually making the world more moral. So that's how twisted this kind of thinking became. So that's one kind of pretty radical way of biological determinism obviously leading to dehumanization. Now obviously it doesn't lead to that level of dehumanization of the Nazi period in many cases, but it can lead to other kinds of dehumanization. Now let me turn my attention to environmental determinism. So some people would think, a lot of people embrace environmental determinism by the way they think, oh yeah, that biological determinism, that's bad stuff. Look at Hitler and killing all these Jews and everything. But environmental determinism, that's more friendly. We can educate people, we can, lift people up and elevate people through education and, upbringing and such. But I would argue that environmental determinism is just as problematic. And the environmental determinism, the idea that behavior is just determined by our environment, was also a very prominent idea in the mid-19th century on up until the mid-20th century. And it still has a lot of resonance if you get involved in fields like sociology, psychology, although psychology is split. There's some biological determinists, some environmental determinists in the field of psychology. But sociology is largely environmental determinists there. There's other fields too where environmental determinism is pretty strong today. One form of environmental determinism in the middle of the 19th century that emerged was socialism. And I'm going to look just at Marx in particular as one exemplar of that. Marx thought that his ideas were scientific socialism. That's the term he used himself. He and Engels used this term, scientific socialism. And the reason he thought it was scientific socialism is because he thought everything was determined. He thought it was determined by the environment. So you change the environment, you can change society. And not only change society, you change human nature itself. You can just transform humans and transform human nature by changing the environment, particularly the economic environment for Marx. He's an economic determinist, which is a specific kind of environmental determinist. So Marx was hoping that this would end the oppression of the working class. And indeed, one of Marx's primary goals was freedom. A lot of people think, by the way, that Marx was shooting mostly for equality. Marx just talks about equality. He wants a classless structure and such. So there's some notions of equalizing and such. But if you read Marx very carefully, what he's actually more interested in is liberation and freedom. And this comes through in a lot of different ways. I mean, obviously he talked about oppression and other kinds of things like that he's fighting against and such, but he's fighting for freedom. So now the question that arises then is why don't we associate Marxist regimes with freedom, if that's what Marx was pushing for? And I would argue it's because his vision of human nature was defective. He had a wrong view of human nature. And Others following in his train who tried to apply these things to society, like Lenin and Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot and Castro and all sorts of others, were trying to reshape humanity using this idea of environmental determinism and specifically economic determinism, but they ended up producing oppressive regimes themselves. And it's because they viewed humans as just being sort of a cog in the machine without dignity, without free will, and such. So I would argue that that's really what sort of brought them down to that particular kind of level. Okay, now we've been talking about biological determinism. Now we talked about environmental determinism. Now I want to sort of shift the focus just a little bit and talk about one major thinker, Nietzsche, who was anti-determinist, who was trying to react against determinism. So Nietzsche was in fact arguing against scientific biological determinism of the 19th century. He was also arguing against environmental determinism because he was also wanting to promote freedom, and he was trying to promote individual freedom. Here's a couple of his books, of course, The Will to Power, published posthumously, Beyond Good and Evil, some of his main works. And Nietzsche was hoping that by introducing this idea of radical human freedom, that he could rescue humanity from scientific reductionism. So Nietzsche argued that humans don't have fixed essences, that there is nothing fixed about humanity, so he's rejecting biological determinism. But he also claimed that we're not determined by our education or environment either. You are radically free, according to Nietzsche, to shape who you are. It's your choices, your free choices, that will determine who you are and what your destiny is. And not only does your free choices shape your own behavior, but Nietzsche also believed that knowledge and truth are created by our will. That knowledge and truth are not something that are determined by some fixed scientific laws or fixed sociological laws or anything like that, but we can choose what to believe and what knowledge is. So this is the notion of the will to power. So Nietzsche is arguing that he's trying to bring freedom to humanity. And again, so trying to elevate humanity once again. However, if we look at Nietzsche's philosophy didn't bring freedom either to humanity. In fact, if Nietzsche himself was actually only arguing that he was going to bring freedom to a very small select group of humanity, the Übermensch, the Overman or Superman of Nietzsche. In fact, Nietzsche had utter contempt for humanity and the masses. He talks about the masses of people. He talks about how they're just governed by the herd mentality, he talks about. And he believes that these Übermensch, these supermen figures who he sees not as being aristocrats in the traditional sense, but sort of creative geniuses, aristocrats in that sense, are going to break free. And he looked with utter contempt on the masses. And by the way, included in the masses were all women. He had utter contempt for all women. He was totally misogynistic and believed that these supermen really were men, not women. So he thought that these supermen then should rise up and dominate and oppress. I mean, he even uses these words, dominate and oppress the masses. And so it's a philosophy of life. Actually, he calls it that. In fact, the Germans even use the term Lebensphilosophie to refer to Nietzsche and some of the successors of Nietzsche's philosophy in the late 19th and early 20th century. But it's only life for the few. It's death and destruction and oppression for the many in society. And so we're going to find then Nietzsche's philosophy getting spelled out. Nietzsche also, with his Beyond Good and Evil idea, also was going to reject any kind of fixed morality. He thought that morality was just something we create, and so we can choose what morality is. Now, interestingly, he didn't think that everyone could choose their own morality. It's the supermen that choose the morality and then impose it on everyone else. And so they're the ones who then dominate and control and fix what the morality really is for the rest of society, which of course is then that morality is supposed to serve them. It's supposed to serve the supermen figures rather than the masses of people. Now, in the 20th century, Nietzsche's ideas were going to be taken in a lot of different directions, I don't have time to get into it in great detail, but if you ever read Nietzsche, there's a lot of aphorisms, short, pithy sayings and such. Nietzsche's remarkably difficult to interpret, in part because he wanted to be remarkably difficult to interpret. He was an irrationalist. He didn't want to have a consistent, worldview system set out there or something. And so actually there were a lot of, in the feminist movement, even though he was misogynist, the feminist movement actually liked Nietzsche because he was bashing Christianity and bashing traditional ideas that they also didn't like. But interestingly, a lot of some various philosophers in the 20th century were going to take over Nietzsche's approach. And in the middle of the 20th century, two of the most prominent of those were Martin Heidegger in Germany and Jean-Paul Sartre in France. Sartre was going to argue that life is absurd, life has no meaning, no purpose, one can freely choose what your own purpose is, and the particular purpose that Sartre chose politically was communism. Sartre considered himself a Marxist, even though he wasn't certainly a orthodox Marxist in any stretch of the imagination, because his existentialist philosophy was diametrically opposed in certain ways to Marxism. That is, he rejected determinism, which was sort of foundational to some more orthodox forms of Marxism. But Sartre chose communism and even praised Stalin, in the 1940s, late 40s, and early 50s. As did many other French intellectuals, by the way, at the same time. He wasn't alone. A lot of other French intellectuals did likewise. There's a really interesting book about that called The Past Imperfect that details that. But so we have here one example, Sartre, praising communism and Stalinism and that kind of oppression. Heidegger, on the other hand, praised Hitler. Heidegger in 1933, when Hitler came to power, joined the Nazi Party and became the rector of the University of Freiburg. And he began giving speeches where he was promoting Hitler and Nazism. Now, later on, he backed away from that somewhat, although he never really repented of it. He never apologized for anything he did. Even after World War II, he just basically claimed that he didn't really do that, or he hadn't really been involved in that, tried to cover up what had happened. But in the 1990s, a lot of scholarship came out and uncovered a lot of interesting information about Heidegger, showing that he was pretty fanatically on board with Hitler in 1933 anyway. And so here we have two key disciples of Nietzsche, Heidegger and Sartre, promoting some of the greatest oppressive regimes of the 20th century. And I would argue the reason they could do that is because they didn't have any moral reason not to. They didn't have there's no objective morality in their views. So, basically you could move in whichever direction you want. And so if you want to support Stalin, that's legitimate, as long as you're making that authentic choice, to use Sartre's term, and authenticity, which he thought was important. Heidegger, on the other hand, could choose Nazism. So there's no real notion of what choices to make. And people building upon Nietzsche's philosophy in the late 20th century, after Heidegger and Sartre, sometimes referred to as postmodernists. I mentioned Foucault earlier as one example of that. Also ended up following Nietzsche's approach, although sometimes they're a little less individualistic. They talk more about the social construction of reality rather than the individual construction of reality. But still, the idea is that we are constructing our own reality, which includes morality. We're constructing our own reality, which includes morality and other kinds of things. Okay, so now what are the implications of this? Well, I would argue that these dehumanizing ideologies, and Darwinism, Marxism, and Nietzscheanism are just three examples among many others, but very influential. Some of the more influential examples over the past couple of centuries have led us into what today some people refer to as a culture of death. Many people believe life has no purpose, no meaning. and no particular value. Humans are just the product of a cosmic accident. In fact, we're the product of, if you believe in the standard evolutionary story, we're a product of millions of copying mistakes. So we're just a colossal mistake, I suppose. So there's no real value and worth to humanity. And because of that, that's given rise to easy acceptance of various death-bringing procedures and such as abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, suicide, and assisted suicide. And so I would argue that these kinds of dehumanizing philosophies have led us into the easy acceptance of those kinds of things in our society. And if we want to sort of turn back deal with these issues of life and death, then we're going to have to find ways of reaching our society and trying to undercut and show people the way that those philosophies have undermined humanity. And one of the things that I try to do, let me sort of close with this, one of the things I try to do in my book, Death of Humanity, and one approach that I take, is I try to show the way that many of these secular philosophies lead to this kind of nihilism and dehumanization. And I try to show how people really are not consistent with that in the way that they treat humanity or think about humanity or such. I mean, there's lots of examples of this kind of thing, but many people can say on the one hand, and by the way, one of the more profound examples I give in my book is Bertrand Russell, who on the one hand, when he was philosophizing, said humans have no value, no purpose, no meaning, and such. But in his own personal life, he was a supporter of pacifism, opposed nuclear arms, other kinds of things, because he realized that human life does have value at some level. And he argued on the one hand that morality is just emotions. But on the other hand, he was very moralistic in his life. And in fact, his daughter, Catherine Tate, wrote a book called My Life with Bertrand Russell, where she says he was an absolutist morally, despite the fact that his own philosophy was there's no such thing as objective morality. So one thing that I try to do in trying to deal with people who embrace these secular philosophies is show the contradictions, inconsistencies, and such, and to show them the consequences of these dehumanizing philosophies.